In 1960s Canada, you could buy a house in Toronto for $15,000 on a single income. Doctors made house calls for $5, and nobody locked their doors at night. University cost $250 per year. A new car was $2,500. You could raise a family of four on $6,000 annually and still save money. It wasn't just cheaper, it was a completely different economic reality that today's Canadians can barely comprehend. But here's what makes 1960s Canada truly alien to modern life. It wasn't just prices that were different. The entire social structure, cultural values, and daily routines were unrecognizable compared to today. Women needed their husband's permission to open a bank account. Homosexuality was illegal. Indigenous children were still being forcibly taken to residential schools. You couldn't get divorced without proving adultery or cruelty in court. The comfortable nostalgia people feel for the 1960s ignores how restrictive and discriminatory that world actually was. This is what daily life actually looked like in 1960s Canada. The economic opportunities that seem impossible today. The social restrictions that would be unthinkable now. And why comparing then to now reveals how fundamentally different countries we're really talking about. The stat everyone cites about 1960s housing affordability is real, but incomplete. The average home in Toronto cost $15,000 in 1965. The median household income was $6,000. That's a 2.5 to 1 ratio. Today, the average Toronto home costs $1.1 million with median household income around $85,000. That's almost 13 to 1. But here's what the simple math doesn't capture. Those $15,000 homes were 900 square foot bungalows with one bathroom, no air conditioning, minimal insulation, and often no basement. They were in suburbs like Scarborough or Etobicoke that took 90 minutes to reach downtown by streetcar. The homes were smaller, simpler, and further from anything people wanted. Toronto's population in 1960 was 1.8 million. Today it's 6.4 million. Vancouver had 790,000 people in 1960. Today it has 2.6 million. The cities were smaller because fewer people wanted to live in them. Most Canadians still lived in rural areas or small towns. The urban housing that was affordable partly because demand was lower. Here's the lifestyle that affordable housing required. Maximum. No eating out except special occasions. No vacations beyond driving to a provincial park and camping. Clothing was repaired repeatedly instead of replaced. Maybe one TV. And socializing with neighbors. The low cost of housing was offset by having almost nothing else. But here's what that economic structure enabled. A single income could support a family because expenses beyond housing were minimal. There was no cable TV bill, no internet, no cell phones, no subscription services, no eating out 3 times per week. The household budget was mortgage, utilities, food, and maybe a car payment. That simplicity made single-income households viable in a way they aren't now. Canada didn't have universal health care until 1966, and even then it was only Saskatchewan. Most provinces didn't implement Medicare until the early 1970s. You paid for doctor visits, hospital stays, and prescriptions out of pocket. A doctor's house call cost $5. A hospital birth cost $50. Major surgery could cost hundreds. But here's what made this system work differently than American healthcare. Doctors charged reasonable fees because they were expected to. The Canadian Medical Association had fee schedules that doctors largely followed. There was social pressure against price gouging. Healthcare was expensive but not bankrupting because the culture enforced reasonable pricing. What's completely foreign to modern life is how accessible doctors were. Most family doctors did house calls routinely. They came to your home within hours, examined you, and left medicine if needed. This wasn't concierge medicine for the wealthy. This was normal practice. Doctors lived in the neighborhoods they served and knew their patients personally. The medical technology was primitive by today's standards. No CT scans, no advanced diagnostic imaging. Antibiotics existed, but the range was limited. Many childhood diseases that are now rare through vaccination were common. Polio was still a real threat in the early 1960s. Measles, mumps, and rubella infected thousands of children annually. But here's the trade-off nobody talks about. Healthcare was more personal and accessible, but far less effective. Diseases that are easily treatable today killed people regularly in the 1960s. The $5 house call was affordable, but what the doctor could actually do for you was limited compared to modern medicine. The classic 1960s economic story is that a single factory worker could buy a house and support a family. This is true, but requires context. The median household income in 1965 was $6,000. That's equivalent to about $55,000 in 2024 money. Not wealthy, but survivable. Here's what that income bought. A mortgage of $100 to $150 per month. Utilities of $20 to $30 monthly. Groceries for a family of 4 ran about $100 per month. A car payment, if you had one, was $50 monthly. That's under $400 in monthly expenses. With $500 monthly income, you could save $100 every month. But here's what didn't exist to spend money on. No cable TV that cost $100 monthly. No cell phone plans for everyone in the family. No regular eating out. No expensive hobbies requiring constant equipment purchases. No travel industry marketing vacations as essential rather than luxury. The single-income household worked because there was almost nothing to buy beyond necessities. Entertainment was free or cheap. Kids played outside unsupervised. Families socialized with neighbors instead of paying for activities. The consumer economy that absorbs modern middle-class income barely existed. But here's the hidden cost. Women staying home wasn't always choice. Many women wanted to work but couldn't because hiring married women was often prohibited. Banks required husbands to co-sign loans to their wives. Credit cards were denied to women without male permission. The single-income household was partly economic, but partly enforced by discrimination. 1960s Canada looks appealing economically, but the social restrictions were suffocating by modern standards. Women couldn't serve on juries in some provinces until 1971. Indigenous people couldn't vote federally without giving up treaty rights until 1960. Homosexuality was illegal until 1969. Abortion was illegal until 1969. Divorce required proving fault until 1968. Here's what women's lives looked like. Most women couldn't get credit without a male co-signer. Many employers had policies against hiring married women. Birth control pills were technically illegal until 1969, though some doctors prescribed them anyway. Women who worked earned 50 to 60% of what men earned for identical work. But here's what sounds completely foreign to modern life. Married women needed their husband's permission to open bank accounts, apply for credit cards, or obtain passports in many cases. This wasn't rare discrimination. This was standard practice, backed by law and social norms. Indigenous people faced systematic oppression that was government policy. Residential schools were still operating throughout the 1960s. Indigenous children were forcibly removed from families and sent to schools designed to eliminate their culture and language. The last residential school didn't close until 1996, but the 1960s were peak operation years. Thousands of children were in the system. The immigration system was explicitly racist. The White Canada policy wasn't officially ended until 1962. Before that, Canada had immigration quotas designed to keep the country majority white and British. Asian immigration was severely restricted. Black immigration from the Caribbean was limited. The points-based immigration system that Canada is now famous for didn't exist until 1967. But here's the cultural attitude that made this possible. Most white Canadians saw this as normal and appropriate. The concept of multiculturalism didn't exist. The idea was that Canada was a British country with French accommodation in Quebec. Everyone else was expected to assimilate completely or not come at all. Imagine daily life with no internet, no computers, no cell phones, no streaming, no social media, and limited television. That was 1960s reality. The impact on daily routines was far more profound than people realize. Television existed, but barely. CBC and CTV were the only English channels most Canadians received. Programming started mid-afternoon and ended around midnight. There were no 24-hour channels, no specialty channels, no cable packages. You watched what was on, or you didn't watch TV. Communication required planning impossible for modern people to imagine. Landline phones were the only option. Long-distance calls cost several dollars per minute. You didn't just call people casually. You scheduled calls or used them for emergencies. Most communication was face-to-face or by mail. But here's what this meant for social life. You had to show up because there was no way to change plans once you'd left home. If someone was late, you waited because there was no way to check where they were. If plans fell through, you just went home. The lack of instant communication required reliability that modern culture has completely lost. Information access was radically limited. If you wanted to know something, you went to a library and looked it up in an encyclopedia or card catalog. If the library didn't have the information, you were out of luck. Specialized knowledge was genuinely hard to access. Experts had information monopolies because distributing knowledge was difficult. Shopping required going to stores during business hours. Stores closed at 6 p.m. on weekdays and 5 p.m. on Saturdays. Nothing was open Sunday except corner stores. You shopped during lunch breaks or Saturdays. No 24-hour stores, no ordering anything from home. But here's the impact nobody thinks about. People had dramatically more unstructured time because there was less to do. You couldn't scroll social media for 3 hours. You couldn't binge watch anything. Entertainment required more effort, so people did less of it. Boredom was a normal part of life that you dealt with rather than immediately filling with content. Canada's crime rate in the 1960s was significantly lower than today for most categories. The homicide rate was 1.3 per 100,000 people in 1960 compared to 2.0 per 100,000 in 2022. Property crime rates were lower. Violent crime was lower. The common perception that the 1960s were safer is statistically accurate. But here's what the statistics don't show. Domestic violence was massively underreported because it was considered a private family matter. Sexual assault was rarely reported because police and courts routinely dismissed women's claims. Discrimination and harassment weren't crimes. They were normal life for many Canadians. The criminal justice system was far harsher. Capital punishment wasn't abolished until 1976. Throughout the 1960s, Canada was still executing people convicted of murder. Prison sentences were longer. Parole was less common. The entire philosophy was punishment rather than rehabilitation. But here's the social control mechanism that replaced modern surveillance. Everyone knew everyone. In small towns and tight-knit urban neighborhoods, reputation was everything. Criminal behavior meant social ostracism. People behaved partly because getting caught meant being shunned by everyone who mattered to your life. Youth crime was handled informally in ways that would be illegal today. Police would bring kids home to their parents rather than charge them. Parents were expected to discipline children, and that discipline could be corporal punishment that would now be considered assault. Teachers could physically punish students with straps or paddles. The informal violence that maintained order would be criminal today. University tuition in 1960s Canada was $200 to $300 per year. That's about $2,500 in 2024 money. Compare that to current tuition of $6,000 to $30,000 per year, and the difference is staggering. Higher education was genuinely accessible to working-class students. But here's the catch. Far fewer people went to university. In 1960, only 4% of Canadians had university degrees. Today, it's over 30%. University wasn't seen as necessary for middle-class life. Most good jobs required high school and perhaps technical training, but not degrees. The classroom environment was authoritarian. Teachers had unquestioned authority. Talking back resulted in detention, strapping, or expulsion. Students stood when teachers entered rooms. Dress codes were strictly enforced. Boys wore dress pants and shirts. Girls wore dresses or skirts, never pants. Physical punishment for misbehavior was routine and legal. But here's what that structure produced. Students who conformed learned well in that system. Students who didn't conform were pushed out. There was no accommodation for different learning styles. No special education programs, no concern for mental health. You fit the system, or you left. Curriculum was radically different. Canadian history emphasized British heritage and downplayed or ignored Indigenous peoples. Sex education didn't exist. Science education was basic because the knowledge base was smaller. Computer science didn't exist because computers were room-sized machines that universities barely had access to. Here's the pattern across every aspect of 1960s life. The economic advantages were real, but required accepting lifestyle limitations that modern Canadians would find intolerable. Housing was affordable but basic. Healthcare was accessible but primitive. Single incomes worked, but women were denied opportunities. Society was orderly but oppressive. Education was cheap but limited. The nostalgia for 1960s Canada is selective memory. People remember affordable housing and ignore 900-square-foot homes with no air conditioning. They remember safe neighborhoods and ignore that safety came from social conformity enforced through discrimination. They remember simple times and ignore that simplicity meant limited opportunities for anyone who wasn't a straight white man. But here's what changed and why. Technology created expenses that didn't exist, but also opportunities that were impossible. Social progress eliminated discrimination, but also eliminated the enforced stability that discrimination created. Economic complexity made life more expensive, but also created wealth that 1960s Canadians couldn't imagine. The 1960s weren't better or worse overall. They were profoundly different in ways that make direct comparison meaningless. You could buy a house easily, but couldn't call anyone from your car. You could see a doctor at home, but they couldn't do much for you. You could raise a family on one income, but only if the wife stayed home and gave up autonomy. Would you actually want to live in 1960s Canada? Only if you were willing to give up everything that makes modern life convenient, connected, and free from discrimination. The price of $15,000 homes was living in a world most Canadians today would find suffocating, and the difference matters more than nostalgia admits.